A man once feared by an entire city now sits in total silence. No visitors. No phone calls that matter. No sunlight that isn't filtered through reinforced glass. Before we go further, if stories like this pull you in, consider subscribing. Drop a comment with your thoughts. It helps more than you know. This is the story of Larry Hoover, a man who built an empire from a single Chicago neighborhood. A man federal prosecutors called one of the most dangerous criminal masterminds in American history, and a man who, decades later, would vanish into the most secure prison on earth. Some questions still don't have clean answers. Did Hoover ever truly relinquish control? Or did the system simply decide he never would? We begin in Chicago, in the 1970s. Streets lined with row houses and broken promises. Economic abandonment had hollowed out entire blocks. Into that vacuum stepped young men looking for structure, protection, identity. Hoover offered all three. What started as a street organization grew into something larger, eventually known as the Gangster Disciples. Court records describe a hierarchy: rules, territory, federal. Investigators would later call it one of the most organized criminal enterprises in the country. In 1973, everything changed. Hoover was convicted of murder, a crime that should have ended his influence. Instead, prison became his new headquarters. Documents and testimony from that era suggest something unusual. His authority did not fade behind bars. If anything, it adapted. Letters, visits, coded messages. Prosecutors would later allege a prison sentence that somehow expanded his reach instead of ending it. By the 1990s, Hoover attempted something unexpected. He publicly distanced himself from violence. He spoke about community redevelopment, economic empowerment, peace initiatives. To some, it looked like transformation. To federal investigators, it looked like camouflage. They believed the organization beneath him hadn't changed at all. Only its public face had. That contradiction is where this story lives. Was Hoover evolving? Or was law enforcement watching a performance? The answer would determine the rest of his life. And it would take years of investigation to even attempt. 1. Surveillance, wiretaps, confidential informants. A federal case slowly built around a man already incarcerated. The kind of investigation that doesn't happen by accident. It happens when authorities believe the threat hasn't ended. It has simply gone quiet. In the next chapter, we go inside that investigation. The evidence, the testimony, the legal reckoning that followed. And the moment Hoover's fate was sealed for good. To understand what happened next, you have to understand how investigations like this actually begin. Not with a raid. Not with a headline. They begin quietly, with suspicion. Federal agents had watched Hoover for years, even from inside prison walls. His name carried weight on the streets. Court documents allege the Gangster Disciples had grown into something resembling a corporation. Defined leadership, defined territory, defined rules of conduct. Prosecutors described a structure built for survival, designed to outlast any single leader, including the one who built it. By the mid-1990s, federal investigators believed Hoover was still issuing direction, not through phone calls, not through letters that could be traced easily. Instead, prosecutors alleged, through visitors, conversations disguised as casual family visits, messages embedded in ordinary-sounding sentences. If true, it meant prison hadn't contained him. It had simply changed his methods. To build a case, the government needed more than suspicion. They needed evidence that could survive a courtroom. That meant undercover operations, confidential informants, years of patience. Agents infiltrated layers of the organization slowly. Every conversation recorded carried risk. For agents, for informants, for their families. This is where fear becomes part of the story. Cooperating witnesses understood the danger. Speaking against an organization with deep streets ties was not simple courage. It was a calculated risk, often made out of desperation. Some agreed to testify in exchange for protection. Others did so knowing protection might not be enough. Their names, even decades later, remained sensitive. Not all witnesses wanted recognition. Many wanted to disappear. In 1995, the pressure intensified. A major federal investigation, later tied to wiretaps and informant testimony, began building toward formal charges. Prosecutors weren't just targeting street-level activity anymore. They were targeting Hoover directly, alleging he continued to run a criminal enterprise from inside prison. The implications were enormous. If true, it meant incarceration alone could not neutralize organized criminal leadership. It meant prisons themselves could become operational headquarters. That idea terrified law enforcement agencies far beyond Chicago. It raised uncomfortable questions about prison oversight nationwide. Were visitation policies sufficient? Was monitoring strong enough? Or had the system underestimated what incarceration could not contain? These questions didn't have easy answers, and they wouldn't be resolved quickly. By 1997, the case had matured into formal federal charges, continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy, racketeering, allegations connected to drug trafficking operations. This wasn't simply about past crimes. It was about ongoing influence, allegedly exercised from behind bars. A trial would test whether prosecutors could prove that influence beyond reasonable doubt, and whether a man already incarcerated could be convicted of crimes committed inside the very system meant to contain him. What happened in that courtroom would change everything. Not just for Hoover, but for how the federal government viewed incarcerated leadership entirely. In the next chapter, we step inside that trial. The testimony, the tension, the verdict that sealed his fate. The trial began with a question no one could answer easily. Can a man in prison still run an empire? Prosecutors believed the answer was yes, and they had spent years preparing to prove it. The courtroom filled slowly that first morning. Reporters, family members, federal agents who had worked the case for years. Hoover sat largely composed. According to those present, watching a system attempt to dismantle what remained of his influence, the government's strategy was methodical. Wiretap recordings, testimony from former associates, financial records tracing drug proceeds. Each piece alone seemed small. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Witnesses described a chain of command extending from the street into the prison system itself. Visits that doubled as briefings, conversations that carried instructions, disguised as small talk. If true, it suggested incarceration had become a loophole, not a containment strategy. Defense attorneys pushed back hard. They argued Hoover had genuinely changed, that his public efforts toward community reform were sincere, not strategic. They challenged the credibility of informants. Some had criminal histories. Some had incentives to cooperate. The jury was left entangling motive from memory, truth from leverage. This is where the story grows uncomfortable, because justice rarely arrives in clean narratives. Some witnesses appeared confident, others visibly anxious. Several requested protective measures before testifying. Fear wasn't hidden in that courtroom. It was simply part of the process. Outside the courthouse, Chicago communities watched closely. To some residents, Hoover represented exploitation and violence. To others, he represented an imperfect but real attempt at change. Both perspectives existed simultaneously, often within the same neighborhoods. That tension never fully resolved, even after the trial ended. As the proceedings continued, prosecutors introduced their strongest evidence yet, records suggesting financial transactions tied directly to the organization's drug operations, layered through associates, layered through legitimate-looking businesses. If accurate, it painted a portrait far more sophisticated than typical street crime. It looked, prosecutors argued, like an enterprise built to survive its founder's imprisonment. By the trial's later weeks, something had shifted in the room. The defense's narrative of transformation was straining under cross-examination. Witnesses, who once seemed certain, began contradicting earlier statements. Sealed documents, referenced briefly in testimony, hinted at deeper layers of the investigation, details the jury would not fully hear. Details that remain only partially understood even today. And then, just as the case seemed ready to conclude, a new piece of evidence surfaced, something prosecutors had not previously disclosed in open court, something that would change the final days of the trial entirely. What that evidence revealed, and how it altered Hoover's fate, comes next, because what happens in the next chapter would not just convict a man. It would change how America thinks about incarcerated power forever. The new evidence didn't appear in a dramatic courtroom reveal. Real investigations rarely work that way. Instead, it surfaced through additional witness testimony. Details connecting Hoover more directly to ongoing enterprise activity. Prosecutors framed it as confirmation of what they had argued from the beginning. The organization hadn't been dismantled by his original conviction. It had simply restructured around it. For the defense, this was the moment to find out. Cross-examination intensified. Every informant's credibility was tested again, but the cumulative weight of the testimony was difficult to undo. Pattern after pattern, repeated across multiple independent witnesses. By early 1997, the case moved toward its conclusion. Closing arguments framed to very different versions of the same man. Prosecutors described a calculated leader who never relinquished control. Defense attorneys described a flawed man, trapped by his own past reputation. The jury would have to decide which version they believed. Or whether the truth lived somewhere between both. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Hoover was convicted on federal charges tied to continuing criminal enterprise activity. The sentence that followed was life in federal prison. Not just for the original 1973 murder conviction, but now layered with federal charges that ensured he would likely never be released. Through that case alone, for prosecutors, it was validation, proof that incarceration alone hadn't stopped his influence. For supporters, it felt like a harsher ending than the evidence deserved. Both reactions reveal something important about this story. Certainty is rare. Interpretation often fills the gaps. What happened after the verdict mattered just as much as the trial itself. Federal officials grew increasingly concerned about where Hoover would serve his sentence. A standard federal penitentiary, they believed, wasn't sufficient. To many visitors, to many indirect channels of communication. To much risk that influence could continue, even informally. So a decision was made. Hoover would be transferred to ADX Florence, the most restrictive federal prison in the United States, a facility designed not just to punish, but to isolate completely. Built for inmates considered the highest security risks in the country. Extended solitary confinement, limited human contact, minimal communication with the outside world. For a man whose power had once depended on connection, communication, and presence, this was something close to erasure. Whether that response was justified or excessive remains debated even now. Civil liberties advocates have long raised concerns about ADX Florence's conditions. Years of near-total isolation, they argue, carry serious psychological consequences. Federal officials maintain such measures are necessary for inmates whose influence poses ongoing risk. Both arguments exist in tension, without easy resolution. In the next chapter, we step inside that isolation. What daily life looks like inside the most secure prison in America, and what remained of the man once feared across an entire city. ADX Florence does not look like other prisons. There are no crowded yards, no loud common areas, no real sense of community. It was built for a different purpose entirely: containment without contact. Inmates here spend the vast majority of their time alone. 20-3 hours a day. In many cases, inside a small concrete cell, meals delivered through a slot, conversations through reinforced walls, human connection reduced to its barest minimum. For Hoover, this represented something deeply specific. His influence had always depended on presence, on meetings, on visitors, on a network that could carry his voice forward. ADX Florence was designed specifically to remove all three. Communication restrictions here are among the strictest in the federal system. Limited phone access, monitored mail, reduced visitation, often non-contact, for someone once surrounded by loyal followers. The silence became its own form of punishment. Former corrections officials have described ADX Florence as a facility built for psychological containment, not just physical security. The goal isn't only to hold dangerous individuals. It's to disconnect them from any remaining network of influence. Critics argue this approach raises difficult ethical questions. Years, sometimes decades, of near-total isolation can produce significant psychological strain. Mental health experts have repeatedly raised concerns about long-term solitary confinement, memory difficulties, emotional numbness, diminished capacity for connection. These effects, researchers say, are well documented across Supermax facilities nationwide, whether they were an intended consequence or simply an accepted cost. Remains a difficult question. Supporters of the facility argue the stakes justify the measures. Hoover wasn't an ordinary inmate. They contend his documented history showed influence didn't end with incarceration. It adapted. It found new channels. In their view, only complete isolation could fully sever that influence. Both arguments deserve to be heard honestly, because this story isn't just about one man. It's about a system still figuring out how to handle power inside prison walls. Power that doesn't always disappear when the cell door closes. Over the years, Hoover made several legal attempts to challenge his conditions. Appeals citing health concerns. Appeals citing prolonged isolation. Most were unsuccessful. The system that placed him there showed little willingness to reconsider. Meanwhile, outside the prison, his name slowly faded from daily headlines, but it never fully disappeared. Family members continued advocating for reconsideration of his sentence. Community figures occasionally renewed public conversations about his case. A quiet undercurrent of attention that never fully resolved. The story, in many ways, seemed frozen. A man in isolation. A system in move. A debate without resolution. Until, years later, something unexpected happened. Something that would reopen this case in a way few anticipated. In our final chapter, we examine what that development meant, and what remains of Larry Hoover's story today. For years, Hoover's case seemed permanently settled. A light sentence. A Supermax cell. A name fading from public memory. Then, in December 2022, something shifted. President Joe Biden granted Hoover clemency on his federal sentence. Not a pardon, not full freedom, but a commutation that effectively ended the federal portion of his punishment. The decision surprised many who had followed the case for decades. Advocates had spent years arguing his age, his health, and his years of confinement warranted reconsideration. Family members described a man who had spent over a decade in near total isolation. A man, they argued, who no longer resembled the threat once described in court. The White House framed the decision differently. Officials noted Hoover was elderly, noted his federal sentence had already served its purpose. They were careful to clarify something important. This was not an exoneration, not a declaration of innocence. Hoover still faced a separate Illinois state sentence tied to his original 1973 murder conviction. That sentence remained unaffected by the federal commutation. In practical terms, Hoover was moved out of ADX Florence, but he did not walk free. He was transferred into state custody, continuing his original life sentence. The story, in some ways, hadn't ended. It had simply changed location. For supporters, the federal commutation felt like long overdue acknowledgement that decades of extreme isolation carried its own cost. For critics, it raised familiar concerns. Could influence, once thought contained, ever truly be measured again? That question remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. What this case ultimately reveals isn't a simple story of guilt or innocence. It's a story about how institutions struggle to measure ongoing risk, how power, once built, doesn't always disappear with a sentence, and how isolation, however necessary it may seem, carries consequences that outlast the walls that enforce it. Larry Hoover's name still carries weight in Chicago. To some, a symbol of exploitation and violence. To others, a symbol of a justice system that rarely allows for clean redemption. Both truths exist simultaneously. Neither fully erases the other. Perhaps that's the most honest conclusion this story can offer. Not a clean resolution, but a portrait of a man, a system, and a decades-long struggle neither fully won. If this story moved you, there are other cases just as complex, just as human, waiting to be understood. Consider exploring them next. Thank you for watching.